There's going to come a time in your professional React career to where you're probably going to want to share some state between components. In my previous video, we looked at having some data and then having to send that data through several different layers of components. So this is also called prop drilling. So here we have our user data, we passed it into this nested component, and then we pass it further into this user details component, and then we actually use this data. But on the same level, we have our user data, we pass it into this user card component, and we use it here. So in this example, you probably wouldn't need to have shared state, but it kind of gets to the idea of we have a kind of deeply nested component, at least a few layers deep in our React tree, that needs to use the user state. And this user card component also needs to use it. So we have to lift that user state into this home component and then pass it down into both. Now, in this example, that wouldn't be a big deal. Like if this was your actual application, I would say, hey, just pass these as props. It's not a big deal. But what you're going to find is that sometimes, especially for data like user data, where you might need to use almost everywhere in your application, or at least in a lot of different places in your application, if you have your React tree and say you have a component way over here on your tree, and then this component in the middle of your tree needs it, and then this component over here in your tree needs it, and this component over here needs it, well, you're going to have a really difficult time probably managing that state in just one place. And it's going to be a little bit easier to share that state across your application. So today I'm going to show you one solution to that, and that is using context in React. And just so you know, this starter project will be linked in the description below. So if you do want to follow along as we go, you can absolutely do that. Just make sure to clone the repo, npm install. It is going to be a Next.js project, but I will handle any Next.js specific stuff as we go here as well. So the project is linked down below. Now, if anybody listening to this knows why React actually called it context, let me know. I mean, maybe it's a way to give your components more context throughout your application, but I feel like that's a stretch, and I'm not sure I love the name context, but all it is a way to share state throughout your application. So to solve this issue here, I'm going to open up our Finder here, and we basically need a way to, in our user card here, to consume the user state directly, and also in our user details component, just to consume this state directly. So we're going to create context to do this. So I'm going to create a new folder called contexts plural. And this is where we're going to store, if we had multiple contexts, we would store it here. We'll just have one. I'm going to create a new file called user context.tsx. And later on in this video, we'll go to the React docs to kind of talk about when you should and shouldn't use context. But right now we'll focus on how we can actually solve this problem here. I'm technically in a Next.js application, so I'm going to put use client here up at the top, but you won't need to do this if you're just in a React application. Everything else is going to be just pure React, so it's still going to apply. I just needed to do that for this Next.js project. But here we're going to import create context, React node, use context, and use state from React. And then at the top, we're going to create an interface for our user, or create our types for our user, because we are in TypeScript here. So I'm going to create interface user, and it's going to have a name, which is a string, an email, that's a string, and a bio, that's a string. And then we'll create another interface, and this is going to be for our user context, the type for our user context. So interface, user context type. It's going to have a user, which is going to be our user interface, and then a set user, which is going to be a function that accepts a user, and it is not going to return anything. So just void. So basically that sets up our types there. That's all we did there. If you're not using TypeScript, you can just ignore that part. But now, in order to use context, we first need to create a context, and we do that with the create context function that we import from React. So we need to say const user context is equal to create context. And then this is going to be used as a generic function here in TypeScript. So we're going to say user context type or undefined. And then we're going to call create context. We're going to initialize it with undefined. So when we first call create context, you can call it with an initial value. In our case, we're just going to make it undefined, but we will update this here in just a second, or at least the value. But this will remain the same. So we call create context. That's going to create our user context. Now I'm going to create a provider. You wouldn't necessarily need to do this, but I think it's a little bit easier just to do it in a specific file for this specific context. Because in order to be able to use the values in this context, we need to use a provider. So the way that this is going to look is I'm going to export a const called user provider, and then it is going to accept children because we are going to use this as a wrapper component around other components. And we're going to add a type annotation as React node here. And then within the body of our user provider, I'm going to say const user, comma set user. So just using normal state here. It's going to be use state, and it's going to be of type user. We're going to call it and initialize it with actually some values here. So we're going to have a name, an email, as well as a bio. And I am going to put default values in these. I'm going to do John Doe at example.com, and some random bio here. So we have those all set up. And then now what I want to do is I want to return, I want to wrap my user context provider around the children. So I'm going to say user context dot provider, and then I'm going to pass in a value where we are going to have the user as well as the set user. And then we're going to pass our children in. So what we're basically doing is saying we have this user provider component that we can basically now use this user provider component. We can wrap it around any components that might need to use our user and set user context or user and set user values. We just wrap it around any components that need it. And then these components will be passed along as children. And then those components can consume the values of our user context provider. So they can consume the user as well as the set user state. So we just wrap this user provider around any components that might need to use the values that we set here for our user context dot provider. Now we're going to do one final thing here. We're going to say export const use user is equal to a function. And then we're going to say const context is equal to, and we're going to use the use context hook from React. And when you call the use context hook from React, you need to pass in the context that you want to use. And in our case, it's just going to be our user context. We'll do a check here. If not context, then we will throw new error. And I'll just say no user context, else we will return our context. So basically what this is doing here is when we actually want to use this user context, the way that we're always going to do it is by calling the use context hook and passing the user context in it. So we're just creating this helper function here called useUser that basically, if we just call useUser, we're already just going to be passing the context into use context. And if it exists, we return it. So when we want to use our user context, we don't need to do this step right here. We just call this useUser function, and that's going to return our context. So I know it's quite a bit of steps there. You can, mostly ignore these type annotations here. I think that makes things a little messier sometimes to see, but really all we need to do is call the create context function from React. That's going to create our context. And then we need to wrap that context.provider around any component that is going to want to consume the values of that context. So in our case, we created this user provider function that is going to be a wrapper function that wraps around any component that needs to use the context. We set this value prop to the values that we want to share with those components that are going to be wrapped by this user provider, in our case, the user and set user. And then we create a helper function where we call the use context hook from React. We need to pass it in our context here. And then we're able to just return this context from useUser, which is going to have our user and set user values on it if our provider is wrapped around our components that are calling this useUser function. But now that we've created this user context, now we just need to go use it in our components. So first off, in Next.js here, we're going to go to our layout here, and we're actually going to wrap our user provider around our root layout here. In React, you just want to make sure to wrap your user provider around any component that might need to use the user context. In our case, this root layout is going to wrap our entire application. So we're making sure that any component within our entire application is going to be able to use the user context. So we're wrapping user provider around our root layout here. So all of our components are going to contain our user context or have access to our user context. But now let's start consuming it within our cards here. So in our user card, all we need to do here is say const user is equal to calling useUser. And that's going to return our user context. And we need to make sure to import that. But that's going to return our user context, and then we're destructuring user. Now we don't need any of these props anymore. And I can get rid of all of these. And then here in Next.js, this just needs to be a client component now. So I will just put that at the top. And then if I go to my nested component here, I don't need to pass through my user anymore to user details. So I can get rid of this. I can get rid of this. We can get rid of all of this. And then I'm going to put use client here up at the top of this page as well. And then finally in user details, we can also get rid of all of this, put use client at the top. I can get rid of user details here. And then all we need to do is say const user is equal to useUser from our user context. And then back at our home page, we no longer need to pass the user to either one of these. So we can remove those. I can remove this, and I can remove this. So really, we've simplified our components quite a bit here because we're just consuming our context directly within our user card here, as well as our user details. We're just calling this useUser that we created here within our context. And if I come back to our application and I refresh the page here, you see that nothing changes because everything still works as expected. So basically, instead of just having to pass, starting from our homepage, having our user data and passing it down into our user card and all the way down into our user details, we just use our user context to consume that state directly. So context allows you to consume state directly in components rather than needing to try to pass data around through props. And just to recap really quick for context, step one, you need to create your context using the create context function from React. Step two, you need to provide that context with some data that you want to share throughout your application. So in our case, we have our user data here, and we also pass our set user. And then we need to wrap our user context.provider around any components that might need the value of that user context.provider. We need to make sure to set it here in the value. And then step three is we just need to call the use context function passing in the context we want to use. And that's going to return the values that we set in our user context.provider or your context.provider. And then you can consume that in any function you want to using this use context hook, passing in the context you want to use. And in our case, we just created this helper function here and this helper function here to make things a bit easier. Now, as promised, let's head to the React docs and let's just really quickly cover kind of what they mention here. So they say before you use context, start by passing props. If your components are not trivial, it's not unusual to pass a dozen props down through a dozen components. It might feel like a slog, but it actually can be fairly readable, and you can always kind of follow that data flow. So starting by passing props is not a bad thing. And sometimes your props might look a little bit ugly, but it's really not a bad thing. So you shouldn't always default to using context. And then also you can extract components and pass JSX as children to them. For example, maybe you pass data props like posts to visual components that don't use them directly, like layout posts is equal to posts. Instead, make layout take children as a prop and render layout, and then render the posts within it, and then layout. This reduces the number of layers between the component specifying the data and the one that needs it. And then if neither of these approaches work for you, consider context. So they mention use cases for context, using theming throughout your application, getting the current account. So this is going to be like the logged in user, what we just did. Routing, although a lot of routing solutions use context internally, but it is a use case for it nonetheless. And then managing state as your app grows. And then you might use context together with a reducer, which we'll cover in our next video. But if many distant components need to use that piece of state that you're using, then context might be useful. But just know that it's maybe not always the go-to solution. So here, a nice recap that I kind of covered as well, but context lets a component provide some information to the entire component tree below it. To pass context, you create and export it with my context is equal to create context, like we just kind of went over. Then you just need to use the use context hook from React and then wrap children into your context provider, providing a value to your context. So just kind of what we went over as well. So hopefully that kind of helps understand context in React. We will do another example here where we set up a reducer with context. Context can be pretty tricky, but once you kind of do the whole setup process a few times, it becomes much, much easier. So I hope this video helps, and I'll see you in that next one.